First of all, that was a really interesting response, and I think that there's a lot of places that we can go next. One thing that I would like to do is, and I would potentially like to come back and explore some of what you were just talking about with the afterlife and people who have near-death experiences and supposed afterlife experiences, but what I would also like to kind of make a segment for, if we could, was I receive certain comments, questions, responses about the interviews that I do, and there's a lot of ways that people can get in touch with me in order to do that. But I have actually gotten several responses to your first interview, um, primarily from people, or one person in particular who is religious, and I was wondering if you would be open to me reading some of the comments and asking you to respond to those responses.
Absolutely.
All right, so um, there's there's three or four here that come from a Christian, a Baptist, um, and the first thing that he says is, well, the first thing that he says actually is some compliments the interview and both of us, but then he says, I disagree with the definition of faith that James uses. That is, that faith equals believing without evidence. Many use the word faith this way, but it is not a biblical way or a Christian way of using the term. And I'm going to kind of summarize the essence of the comments, but some of this is quoting, but it's not all directly what's there. So I apologize if there's some inaccuracy, if I'm misrepresenting the comment. But he says that faith is about trust in something. So he says, as an example, whenever you when you spend money on something, you're having some degree of faith, or at least a very strong hope, that it's going to do what it's intended to do. And generally, you have something to back this up. You have a recommendation from someone, or you have reviews, or you know that the company that's selling the product is reputable. He says, this person says that as a minister, he would never, um, well, he is a minister, and he says he would never advise somebody to put faith in something that has no credibility. And he also says that if a business is selling stuff and it's not doing what it's intended to do, then they have no credibility, they don't do well. And so he says what he does is essentially invest in something that, to his mind, does what it promises to do. Now, he makes clear, I think, that religion, to his view, is not the same as buying a product. It's just an analogy to kind of represent his idea of faith as trust in something that, as far as experience can indicate, is reliable. Um, do you have any response to that definition of faith?
Well, let me start by saying that words have usages, not meanings. There's no inherent meaning to particular words. So if that's the definition he wants to use for faith, then that's the definition he's using for faith. So he's completely entitled to do that. So let me use his definition of faith. His definition of faith, it sounds like, and you correct me, I'm going to pause after this so you can correct me if I'm misunderstanding. It sounds like what he's saying is that faith is trust trust in an outcome based on previous or based on evidence. Trust in an unknown future outcome based on prior experience and evidence. Is that basically what he's saying?
Um, I believe that's basically what he's saying. I think, um, again, I could quote it directly and maybe give you a better idea. I think the gist of it is that faith, in his view, does that it. I think for many people, what a faith can do is to offer a certain sense of peace and to offer moral teachings and to guide them through life or through difficulties, and that faith in that sense generally is reliable. And I think also there's a sense of I think it is what you said, and I think especially with an emphasis on what faith can do in the lives of particular individuals.
And I may disagree with the conclusion about being better in the lives of individuals, but the point I believe you are making still stands, that he's basing, he's got a conclusion that some, a tentative, a prediction about what will happen in the future based on what has happened in the past, and that includes the peace comment. And I'm not trying to ascribe that to him because he didn't specifically say that, but the point is that if peace were the example we were using, I expect believing in this particular deity or having this particular belief will result in a more peaceful future because I see that evidenced through people's faith in the past or belief in the past. What he's describing is a logical conclusion. If you were to, and I mentioned this in the last video, Joseph, that if you told me you had a dog, I would believe you, A, for the sake of argument, but B, because it's not a unbelievable thing. Now, I could test it. I could go to your home. I could ask you to send me a picture of your dog. All these are ways for me to try to prove, or ways for you to try to prove, or me to try to conclude that you actually have a dog. And like I said last time, there's no such thing as I'm going down a rabbit hole. I don't mean to, but there's no such thing as ultimate truth. Even if you had a dog with me in the same room and said, "This is my dog. Look at its collar. Look at the thing. I've got the AKC paperwork. Here's the person that sold it to me." It could all be a lie, but the more evidence that's layered, the more believable it becomes. And in the way the money is mentioned, when you purchase something, you hope to have, you purchase something so that you buy what you're purchasing. And you try to purchase from somebody that is reputable based on recommendations from other people, reviews, or your own experience. That is taking prior experience and and evidence and trying to make a prediction on what will occur in the future. That is not my definition of faith. If this person's, and I don't remember his name, if what he's saying is it sounds to me clearly like what he's saying is he believes there's evidence for either the deity itself or the outcome is better by believing in the deity. I would argue that neither of those are true, and we've talked about this in the last video, but to summarize, any benefit that's derived from faith, I believe, is equally as derivable from the lack of faith. I believe that there is no good evidence for any particular deity, and that the amount of evidence that exists for any particular deity is comparable to at least one, if not many other deities, to the evidence for at least one, if not many other deities, and therefore not conclusory. But the main point is there's no good evidence, in my opinion, for the existence of a deity. So, though I applaud this individual for trying to seek his beliefs based on evidence, I would argue there is no evidence. No good evidence.
All right, thank you. So then the second thing that he says has to do with your comments about morality. And he says, and again, some of this I'll be quoting and some of it will be a paraphrase. I'm going to try to be as strict to what he actually says as possible. He says, I applaud James for acknowledging that he does not believe in objective morality. Because you mentioned in the last interview that morality as a concept inherently is subjective in your view. He says many atheists will not do this, that is, say that morality is subjective. But there is no basis for it without God, he says, it being an absolute objective moral code. He goes on. In my view, this creates a big problem, though. I think we all really do believe, or at least sense, that there is an objective morality. And he uses the example of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi party. He says Hitler and a large part of German society ascribed to a view that Germany would be better off if they were to purify, do racial cleansing and other forms of genocide. And he says, was this not objectively wrong? I think atheists have to say no, but theists can say yes. In addition, there is a profound sense among all of us that the answer is yes, it is wrong, no matter how many people agreed with it. The question is, where does that sense of objective morality come from? Intuitively, one possible answer is that there really is objective morality, which necessarily points to God. Here the atheist can claim that this sense of objective morality is really just an illusion. Our sense of it doesn't mean that it is real. However, how does an atheist account for the sense of it? The most common answer is to say that evolution has programmed it into us. There is a selective advantage to a species that senses objective morality, and so natural selection can account for it. He says, I think appealing to evolution as a whole opens up more questions than it answers. But that gets us going in another direction. He says, my point is this, I think belief in God is the right starting point. We sense that morality is objective. We believe there is such a thing as love or as beauty. God existing is the simplest and most obvious answer to the things we observe and believe. That doesn't mean that God does exist, but to deny him requires, I think, another explanation that makes better sense, one I have not heard. Atheists like to start with the assumption that God does not exist. Show me evidence. But I don't really think that's a fair starting point, he says. They also need to have an explanation for how the world is the way it is that can be critiqued and questioned.
Let me cut you off. I want to respond to everything he's saying. There are too many in there for you verbally to give me for me to respond to them individually. So either we need to take one by one, or you need to cut it off. I'm cool with taking one by one, and I prefer that. But you've listed so many different things, it's impossible for me to respond to every single individual one. So let me respond to some that I recall right now, okay?
Sure.
All right. First of all, when he says most atheists will do this, and most atheists will claim that there is that morality is objective, he's wrong, and that's a straw man. I'm not trying to be rude to him, but he's wrong. I'm friends with a lot of atheists, and that is not what they feel like. I believe there are probably atheists that feel like there's an objective morality, but the vast majority of them, through my experience, do not. And that's a straw man for him to say that. When he says that atheists start from God does not exist and then say prove it, that is also incorrect. Atheists, it's not about atheism. It's about any conclusion. Atheists is a wrong way to describe it. Atheists don't start anywhere. Atheists lack a belief in a deity. It's almost a bad way to refer to anybody. Are you what's something you don't believe in? Are you an teapotist? Do you not believe that there's a teapot rotating around Mars? You don't call people things they don't believe. You refer to them as things they believe. But it's important that we have a term rather than having to explain a definition every time. So referring to us as atheists, he says that atheists start from the belief that God does not exist and ask others to prove it. No. The null hypothesis is the idea that we shouldn't believe anything unless sufficient proof is given. If Joseph tells me his name is Joseph, that's sufficient for me in the moment to believe. So I believe his name is Joseph, I refer to him as Joseph. When somebody goes, that's not his name, now that's enough evidence to start questioning maybe a little bit. Now, when somebody tells me I'm going to be making $150,000 at a job offer, or no, better yet, let's say it this way: somebody calls me on the phone and say, "Mr. Johnson, I have got the best job offer for you. You're going to be making $150,000 a year by next month." Okay, show me the evidence for that. And the bigger you make the claim, the less evidence for it, the more evidence it requires. But when I believe Joseph, it's based on that his name is Joseph. It's based on previous experiences, based on a logical conclusion, or the necessity of the moment. What need do I have to disprove that his name? If somebody came up to me and said, "My name is Joseph," and I said, "Prove it," it's irrelevant. I don't need to do that. But if somebody says you need to base your life around this, the evidence necessary is higher. And if the claim is a absurd one, like there's a dragon coming to destroy the earth right now, you need to go buy a sword and shield, I would say I would need some evidence for that. But regardless of that, I don't see any evidence. That's irrelevant. I don't see any good evidence for the existence of deity. The point is, I'm not starting from the conclusion. And the vast majority of atheists don't claim there not to be a God. The vast majority of atheists lack a belief in a God. We start from the position that I don't know. And here's a great way to do this. If there was a tin full of marbles, and I said I'd give you $1,000 if you could guess whether they're even or odd, and a guy comes up on the street you've never met, he's got a beard, it's all scruffy, he smells bad, his clothes are rotted and torn, and he's mumbling to himself, he stinks of wine, and he goes, "They're even." Do you believe him that they're even? No. Does that mean you believe they're odd? No. It's not a belief that there is no God. It's a lack of belief, asking for evidence to prove that there is or is not a God. So again, he's creating a straw man on that one. He also created a straw man on the evolution about our feelings about morality. First of all, a lot of those feelings are cultural. I mentioned eating a tarantula last time. Children up to a certain age will eat anything you hand them. Scientific tests prove that if you hand them fecal matter, they will try and tell them to eat it. They will eat it up to a certain age because they need to. I don't want to get into an evolution conversation because that's not what this is about. But when you try to shut down evolution with the idea that it opens up more questions than it answers, that is literally what God does. God is a placeholder without any explanation. God did it. All right, where did God come from? Who created God? Why is he doing it? How did he do it? All those are, the response to those is God. It opens up an infinite, it is literally a placeholder that provides no explanation, except it's God. And it has an infinite regress. It's God, it's God, it's God. It's echoing beyond comprehension. Evolution, the idea of a theory, and I'm not trying to talk about evolution, I'm just painting a picture for the difference. Evolution is a theory, and theory means an amalgam of facts which collectively paint a general picture about our understanding of a thing. Gravity, for example. We know a lot about gravity. We don't know a lot about gravity. We have a theory of gravity, which works, but not in every instance, not to the particular degree. Theory means an amalgam of facts which together paint a general picture of our knowledge of a particular thing. When you say opens up more questions than it answers, there are a lot of questions out there we do not have answers to. But putting God as an answer does not answer anything. It is literally a placeholder, and it closes people off to asking more questions. And then he talked about objective moral code. He talked about Hitler killing people and how it's objectively wrong to commit genocide. I don't want to go into this because I find it ultimately exercise in futility. God repeatedly, or the Bible repeatedly, sanctions genocide in different ways. Deuteronomy 20:16-17. But of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth. Joshua 10:40. So smote all the country, he left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And I don't want to get into specifics because there's different interpretations that people could say of the language, and they can imply their own meaning and feel like they've given an answer to it. When we have a feeling about what's good and what's bad, it's partly a result of culture. It's partly a result of our own predilections and wanting to justify how we feel. We all have I mentioned the homosexuality thing. Some people have a disgust in response to it, and that's okay. But to tell somebody else that they're not allowed to do something because you feel that way is not justifiable. The reason that people aren't allowed to do something is because society is ultimately benefited by not allowing it. Rape, theft, murder. So the feeling we have about Hitler is partly a cultural thing, it's partly a logical thing, it's partly an evolutionary concept. But war is a great example. Killing other people is a great example of something that is generally considered not okay. In fact, it's one of the 10 Commandments: thou shalt not kill. But war is one of the most natural things we do, and I'm talking more on a smaller level, but chimpanzees go to war, in quotes, with each other. And it's no surprise that we do too. Conflict is a natural thing in animals. It's our logic that gets us out of that. I challenge you to come up with one objective moral claim. And I don't mean one objective moral claim. The easiest one to go to is rape, because clearly rape is wrong. It is the definition of rape is doing something to somebody that they don't want done to them, and it's about as vile as it can get. It's not wrong because God says it's wrong. It's wrong because you're harming somebody against their will. All these are logical ways to reach these conclusions. It's no surprise that in the Bible it says don't kill. I don't want to be killed. Guess what's not in the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not rape. The Old Testament allows rape in a lot of different ways. One of the ways you're supposed to kill your enemy and take their virgins. That's in the Bible. And again, you can pick and choose what parts you want and say that they're replaced or say that the language is incorrect. But ultimately, it's a reachable conclusion, and people can seemingly justify it. The morality that we create is based ultimately on logic. But the logic is used based on a subjective, and I don't need to rehash this. You can listen to the previous one. I challenge. He mentioned the Hitler thing, genocide. Yeah, genocide is wrong in my opinion, and I challenge to see a way that it's okay. But if thinking a hypothetical, if you were the person who had to choose between, and it's the train example. If you're the person with the switch to switch the train tracks from A track or B track, and the train's going along and can't see what it's about to hit, and there's an entire race of people on the left that compromises 1/10 of the population of the world, and there's another 9/10 on the right, and the train is clearly going towards the 9/10, do you switch the tracks? And usually it's sociopaths that say you switch the track because they lack the empathy they lack the ability to empathize with these individuals, so it's easier for them to see that the better choice is to go left. And we have these discussions that I don't want to choose either. But the idea that it's moral not to flip the switch or to flip it is negotiable. It's arguable. It's not objective. You can reach a conclusion objectively, but you start from a subjective premise. There was more he said, but again, there's so many different things. So why don't you, if you have any questions for what I said, and continue into anything he mentioned, anything else he mentioned.
All right, thank you again for your answer. I think that you basically responded to everything that he said about objective morality. The main portion of his argument there was there's a universal sense of morality that people have, and that seems to present evidence for God. And your counter argument was that there's really not a universal sense of morality uh, that people have. Is that
And let me ask you, if there were truly a universal sense of morality, then no one would do immoral things.
all right? So, and then his last comment is about a slightly more tangible point. I don't know if that's quite how I should put it, but yeah, he said the issue of the existence of Jesus. He says it's increasingly popular among some people to propose that Jesus never actually existed as a person. Um, he says, I think you have to have a highly skeptical view of history that is not warranted in order to conclude something like this. Uh, what he says he means is we know very little about history at all if we don't know Jesus existed. He refers to your comment in the previous interview that there were no contemporary sources, nothing written during the time that Jesus was allegedly alive uh, regarding him. And the commenter says that's true. There are no contemporary records, but why would there be? He only really led a movement that drew attention for a period of 6 to 9 months. It would be highly unusual to have a contemporary source written in that time frame. We have nothing like that for Pilate or Herod either, two leading political figures of the whole region for many years, but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist. And he says that there's evidence in writing from the time period of people who knew Jesus that he did exist, the writings that refer to him while not.
Cut you off, Joseph,
Mhm.
because for a couple of reasons. Number one, to me, I guarantee you this individual is not teaching classes in this, and neither am I. So to get into the absolute specifics, I'm not gonna. It's not my position. It's not my area of expertise to talk about specifics regarding evidence for and against Jesus. There's no contemporaneous record. There are records of other. I think viewers would say, but now you're just going into it. Well, it was asked, and I'm not just going to let it stand because this guy gets a voice to make a point, and it seems like he's not being argued against. Let me say, Joseph, I respect that he's got his opinion, that I'm not an expert, and neither is he, although I would argue that he's wrong. Again, I'm not an expert, and I'm not claiming Jesus didn't exist. I made that point in the last one. My opinion is that there is a sufficient argument that he didn't exist, but that I'm not concluding that that's necessarily true. There were other rebels at the time with short-lived rebellions that were recorded, and when he says there are other individuals that there are no record for outside of the Bible, I have out if they're first of all, I don't need to go into it again. The point is, we need if you want to look that up, I would suggest reading more material and not coming here, not coming to this interview. And also, I wouldn't take that guy's. No offense to him, I respect that he's making a comment, and I'm not trying to insult him. But there are experts out there who disagree, and there are experts who conclude that Jesus did exist. But I don't think we're in a position to really have this discussion. And I would argue that this guy's incorrect. That if individuals are only named in the Bible and not elsewhere, well, then their existence is up for debate as well. And the further we go back in history, the more it becomes up for debate. Napoleon, we all agree, existed. But if you go back further, King Henry, we all agree King Henry V existed. But the further and further you go, the more difficult it is to conclude with specifics or to conclude specifics about their existence. And when you go back to 2,000 years ago, I got the records don't exist contemporaneously with Jesus. The Romans kept ridiculous records about who was executed and who wasn't. Again, I'm not urging anybody listening to me to conclude that Jesus did not exist. I would suggest strongly going to look at other evidence and not taking what I'm saying or what the comments this individual made as proof of the existence or non-existence. I would read Richard Carrier's book. I'd read books to the contrary. I think the main point I'd like to make is that even if Jesus did exist, it does not prove the existence or non-existence of God.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so essentially, there's a little bit more to a comment, but I think that basically you've responded to some of it, and I think that really your response is that this is not a dialogue that you particularly feel prepared to enter into, since you're not an expert. We don't know for certain if he is an expert. I'm not an expert, so
And let me add that when we talk about the expert thing, we're talking about factual circumstance, historical record. We're talking about being able to interpret different languages from centuries ago, dead languages, millennia ago. So this isn't something where we can just go back and forth based on Wikipedia pages. This is an intense subject that has been debated for centuries and is not going to be concluded anytime soon, in my opinion, to a sufficient degree. So when I say expert, I mean experts. Those are the people who should be talking about, who should be having these arguments, and we should be reading them and discussing them between each other, but concluding that Jesus did or didn't exist based on two laymen talking back and forth. And I'm assuming he's a layman. Even if he's not, I'm not prepared to, I'm not learned enough in the particulars of this topic to have this discussion. And that doesn't mean he's right. I need to make that point, that merely by not recording, it doesn't make someone correct or incorrect. I would just urge people that if they're interested in it, they should look to Richard Carrier. I say that because he's the one, I mention him repeatedly because it's his opinion that the reason that Jesus, that the majority of scholarly work prior to him, and I say the majority, and it is, but not all, but the majority, believe that Jesus existed, is because they're typically, they were usually funded by the church, who had an interest in proving that Jesus existed. And again, I'm not making his point for him, I'm mentioning his point. And I mention him because he is generally well respected in his field and has that particular argument. He is not the only one, and there are people who disagree with him